critical is realistic carbon budgets because they are out of date, they're not realistic, and they're not going to achieve the Paris goal. So even if we get to net zero by 2050, we're going to be way above the temperatures we're aiming for. As we talked about, that means way more risk than people expect. And it's a bit like a broken record on this, but where there is uncertainty, there's a thing called the precautionary principle. If you think it might be a crocodile, don't get in the water. And that's kind of what we're doing, the opposite of the precautionary principle. Where there's uncertainty, we're excluding it and crossing our fingers and hoping everything goes in our direction.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe.
My guest this week is Sandy Trust. Sandy is an actuary. He's the head of organizational risk at M&G, the chair of the Financial Resilience Nature Workstream for the Climate Financial Risk Forum, and he's also the lead author on a number of papers which have been published by the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries in the UK in collaboration with the University of Exeter. And these papers explain the link between our economies and the Earth systems, revealing the extent of the risk to both if we continue as we are. This is Sandy's second time on the show. He joined me last year to discuss the Emperor's New Climate Scenarios, a paper which showed how climate change modelling was dramatically underestimating the risks, both to the Earth and to our global economy. Today, he joins me to discuss their new paper, Planetary Solvency, which builds on the original paper to show the underlying assumptions that are baked into climate change modelling, the flawed risk methodologies underpinning climate policy, the failure to understand and communicate risk with regards to an increasingly uncertain future due to our changing climate, the necessity of modelling and what the impact to our economy, human mortality, nature, and society will be if we continue with these flawed climate change policies. A future which they model could see 1/5 of the global economy lost by 2050. On this episode, we discuss this report in full, with Sandy really going into detail about how risks should be adequately calculated. Unsurprisingly to listeners of this podcast, it's all about a systems approach and understanding risks in relation to one another rather than understanding them in isolation. We then go on to explore how government-led policies have tended to have a positive impact in countries around the world, and that our market-led approach to dealing with the climate crisis has failed to address the root causes and failed to actually mitigate against any of the worsening risks that we're facing. We discuss whether or not people's ability to confront the reality of the risks of this century is due to willful blindness, ideology, or even deeply flawed economics, some of which still underpins a lot of climate policy around the world. Sandy talks about the difference between scientists' job with regards to certainties and actuaries' job with regard to possibilities and risk management. And if you read this paper, you will really see how it was obviously written by an interdisciplinary team of actuaries and scientists who are using their combined expertise in understanding Earth systems and then understanding risk to reveal just how much danger we are possibly in this century if we do not change course. Finally, we end with Sandy explaining what needs to happen to our net zero policies if we are to adequately mitigate risk and confront the challenges of this century, which could include widespread mortality, widespread loss of human life, widespread loss of the natural world, catastrophic societal upheaval, and the worsening collapse of our Earth systems.
I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week.
Sandy, welcome back to Planet Critical. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show again.
Rachel, thank you. I'm deeply honoured to be invited back, so thank you very much. Great to be here.
Well, when you contacted me with your new report, obviously we had to get you back on because that first episode about your report that we did last year went really, really, really far. So hoping this update provides a little bit more data to people and also encourages them to send it to your local MP, everybody who's listening.
Yes, do. That's exactly what they should do.
Yeah. Right, Sandy, first question as usual. Why is the world in crisis?
Such a good question. I'm going to try answering this with some poetry, Rachel. Here we go. Rather than face into reality, deny, delay, distract, obfuscate, absurd, of course, bizarre, even, not to avoid, not to prepare, not to change course. Perhaps it has always been too much to expect this shift of consciousness, to expect wisdom from the sapiens, a civilization built on energy and materials and shared stories of collaboration, just needed to heed the science, to harvest energy from a different source, to harness that ingenuity and adaptation, all the busy endeavour and drive to change the great systems of humanity: food, education, finance, economy, transport, energy, to change the beliefs of the humans, those oh so carefully and expensively curated beliefs, before they change the great systems of the planet. That great miracle, the anti-entropic planet, Gaia, the world system, billions of years of life, gathering energy and creating order, building organisms, ecosystems, biomes, species, metabolisms, life, insanely complex, delicate and delicious in its beauty, a gift, a bounty, a resource to be exploited, conquered even, for planes, holidays, Netflix, celebrities and mangoes in December. This is success, wealth, life, billions of years for this. Things, stuff, distractions, ease, gossip, social media. Forget the yawning precipice of climate change, catching all the fish and replacing them with plastic. Forget the obesity, loneliness, sadness and suicide, the migrants and the cities running out of water. Forget space junk and the sixth great extinction. Who needs the Amazon when you have Amazon? Forget all this and more because the economy, silly. Forget the economy needs a society until AI trades bitcoins for the robots. Society needs somewhere to live and food, air, water, shelter, community, meaning. We saw away at the branch we're sitting on, ignoring warnings it could bend or break. It hasn't yet. Stop your wolf-crying antics. Why can't you be happy for the progress? Look at all the people, the wealth, the technology. Well, why can't you see the future distress? Heat, fire, flood, food and water shortages, the mess. Quiet! The football is on and the celebrities are dancing. Rather that than face reality.
Sandy, that's brilliant. When you said you were going to do poetry, I thought maybe you were going to quote T.S. Eliot Wasteland or something, but that's fantastic. You wrote that, right?
I wrote that. That's a Sandy Trust original.
That is brilliant. And really, I mean, it encompasses everything.
Thank you.
And I love that the first person to come on this show and answer in poetry was an actuary, because that is the kind of interdisciplinary thinking we need.
Yes, more poetic actuaries.
More point actuaries.
Yeah, I don't know, sometimes you feel the need to get something out, and we've talked about this parallel reality of living your life,
Yeah.
being keenly aware of the risks we're facing. So I just wanted to try and capture some of that because I think it's astonishing how much trouble we're in and how little mainstream knowledge there is at the level of risk, which is probably a neat segue to the next report.
Oh, you stole my line.
Oh, sorry.
That's a very neat segue. Now, when we discussed this last time, you had a report out that was all about climate models, essentially, and the impact on the economy. And I went with the title of Our Global Economy Won't Survive, because that's the leverage and the freedom that I have as a podcaster. Now, in the past year, you and some of the core authors of that report have been working on a new report about risk and how this is what actuaries do, like looking at the risks of what these models are likely to play out, how risk is being underestimated, and the diagnosis has not gotten better in the year since we last spoke. In fact, it seems to have firmed up that we are currently on a trajectory that will see our current economy, civilization, our expectations dramatically change by the end of the century.
Yes, yes. I guess as actuaries, it's it might sound a bit weird, but the real primary job of actuaries, what actuaries are legislated to do, is actually to stop failure, to stop the failure of pension schemes, to stop the failure of insurance companies, because society has a very low appetite for those things failing. If pension schemes fail, people run out of money. That's really bad. All sorts of societal consequences. If insurance companies can't pay claims in the future, likewise. So really, actuaries are paid to think about risks, what could impact a pension scheme, what might cause it not to have enough money 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future. And not just risks, but also combinations of risks which might come together to cause that pension scheme to become insolvent, to run out of money in the future. And this is not a new idea for actuaries. Maybe we could take those techniques and actually apply them to the global risks we face, and actually that might be quite powerful. So rather than thinking about a pension scheme running out of money, the framing for planetary solvency is that our economy, as you say, that's the big hook, needs a society, and society needs somewhere to live, and that's what we think of as the Earth system, and that provides inputs to the economy, energy, raw materials, but also food, water, regulates the climate, breathable atmosphere, etc. So it really is the branch we're sitting on. So planetary solvency, as opposed to financial solvency, is assessing the ability of the Earth system to keep providing us with the things we need to have our nice society and Netflix and planes and holidays and all that stuff.
And I mean, give me the top headline. If we continue as we are, will our Earth systems be able to continue supporting our nice society?
I think it's eminently plausible that if we continue as we are, we will experience what you might call extreme or catastrophic risk events. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean by extreme or catastrophic risk events. There was a fantastic paper written by Luke Kemp. Luke Kemp was the lead author, Climate Endgame, and that was published in 2022. And Climate Endgame said we've thought lots about climate change, but we've thought mostly about 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, maybe a hot household, but we haven't thought very much about what happens when it gets hotter. And we haven't come up with what you might think of as kind of a risk impact scale. So if we get to 2 degrees of warming, 3 degrees of warming, what sorts of things might be happening? And so Luke and his co-authors came up with a set of societal impact terms. So they said, well, look, we can't go around thinking that things will never get bad, or there isn't the possibility that things get bad. And referencing the actuarial work again, we're not saying things will definitely get bad. We're not doom mongering. The very essence of risk management is imagining things that could go wrong so that you can take action to prevent them. So Luke and his co-author said, well, we really need a kind of a taxonomy of risk. So they define some terms like systemic risk, extreme climate change, 3 degrees or more by 2100, extinction threat, societal collapse, global catastrophic threat, global decimation risk, loss of 10% of population or major disruption, and said, this isn't scaremongering. This is just good risk management. And actually, if you look at insurance regulation, actuaries have to support insurance companies to do something called reverse stress testing. Sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? But what reverse stress testing is come up with a scenario or scenarios which would cause your organisation to become insolvent, and see how you would survive. And actually, organisations have to go further than that and actually have to provide a plan for if they do become insolvent, so it's done in organised fashion. So this isn't doom mongering, and it's not fatalistic. It's good risk management. So planetary solvency, we said, well, what if we took Luke's work and we then expanded it? So rather than just looking at climate change, we looked at some other risk dimensions. So you talked about the economy, so let's look at economic impacts, and rather than limiting ourselves, let's think about, to use Luke's language, what would a decimation event be? A 10% hit to the global economy. What would catastrophic mean? A 25% hit to the global economy. So we've got a climate dimension, economic dimension. Let's do mortality. Like there could be major mortality shocks if we don't change course. So let's put that on our scale. And let's put nature on our scale. So we have a dimension for nature, and let's put societal impacts on our scale as well. So if you look at catastrophic, people can see this in the appendix to the report. We're saying, so climate, 2 degrees or more of warming by 2050. That's, in my view, quite likely if you look at the current temperature and the pace of warming. We cover that in the report. What would nature impacts be? So we'd say catastrophic might be breakdown of some critical ecosystem services. For people who are not sure what those are things like raw materials, climate regulation, fresh water provision, breakdown of some earth systems, major extinction events in multiple geographies, and ocean circulation severely impacted. Catastrophic societal impacts, severe socio-political fragmentation in many regions, low-lying regions lost, heat and water stress driving voluntary mass migration of billions, catastrophic mortality events from disease, nutrition, thirst and conflict. So again, we're not saying this is a nailed-on certainty, but we're trying to come up with a sensible risk taxonomy for assessing global risks and communicating them to policyholders. And the headline is that catastrophic or even extreme risk events are eminently plausible unless we change course. And what do I mean by change course? I mean that we need really immediate policy action, because the market-led approach we've had in place so far is simply not delivering.
Yeah. Now, I think what's so interesting about everything you've just said and this report is that it highlights that within our current climate policy framework, there is an implied acceptance of certain risks. So even the idea of, oh, we'll let it go up to 1.5, like 1.5, we can handle the fallout. Or let's create a model and a scenario as well for 2, and we're heading there so we can handle the fallout. I mean, the idea that we could be pushing towards 3 degrees warming, which I don't think is implausible either, considering, you know, we've shot past the Paris Agreement in less than a decade, means that on a policy level, there's a kind of implication of like, well, things are going to happen, but there's, you know, that's an acceptable risk. But what you and your co-authors have shown is that policymakers are dramatically underestimating the risks that they are accepting through these frameworks.
Right.
And a part of that is because of this methodology that they've used, which you point out, which is, now I'm going to use the wrong language here, I'm going to use more planet critical language here, but the methodology that they're using is not systemic. Like, they are looking at risk of certain things in isolation rather than taking into account tipping points, for example, where there's a sort of cascading effect through the Earth systems and then through society and thus through the economy. So could you speak more to that methodology that is typically baked into climate policy and why you and your team think it's flawed?
I guess the first question is, why does a risk management fail? It's a fantastic exposition of this, Margaret Heffernan willful blindness, and risk management fails a lot. Perhaps it's because risks aren't understood. So if you think about the complexity of climate change and tipping points and the interaction of tipping points, a lot of people just don't understand that. You have to be quite deep into it. Perhaps it's because risks aren't communicated well. The Challenger shuttle disaster, it's well established fact that people were aware of weaknesses in the Challenger shuttle and had written about those risks not being communicated. The urgency was lost in scientific detail. Global financial crisis, nobody saw that coming, and Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II famously asked the London School of Economics, why did nobody see this coming? And they responded and said, well, really it was a failure of imagination. We could see individual risks, but we couldn't see risks to the system as a whole. So there are a lot of reasons why risk management fails, plus willful blindness. Often we just don't want to see the risk. It's more, much better if climate change wasn't happening. Yeah. So there are lots of reasons risk management fails, and actually, when you look at climate change and nature risks, quite a lot of those are present. The Western reductionist mindset looks at risks in isolation. So if I'm an insurance company, I will typically look at my credit risk, my equity risk, my insurance risk, blah, 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 and then sort of fudge them together a bit, but I'm not looking at risk systemically. As you well know, nature risks are a multiplier for climate risks and vice versa, and they interact with society, and society's reaction can both make the risks worse and make the impacts worse by failing to prepare. So by looking at the risks in isolation, you're understating them because you're excluding the systemic effects, so you're perhaps really considerably understating them. A really good quick example on this one, the Amazon forest tipping point, best estimate temperature, if you look at it from a climate perspective, it is 3 degrees warming. If you take into account deforestation, it's 1.5 degrees of warming.
Wow.
Holy crap, that's where we are already, right?
Yeah.
We've deforested 17% of the Amazon. So the impact of taking into account the other risk drivers is massive. So failure to account for systemic risk, and I'm not being pejorative here, but science thinks very differently from risk. If you think about scientists, they typically won't publish something until they're quite sure of it and they have the evidence and we have the scientific method, and that's a good thing. Risk is the opposite. Risk, you want to talk about things even if they're highly uncertain, particularly if they could be very severe. And back to that word imagination. You're imagining that there could be an iceberg and taking precautions rather than saying, I'm not going to say there's an iceberg until I've seen it and tasted it and touched it and licked it. So those factors have meant that rather than treading cautiously when we're uncertain, we've simply excluded the uncertainties and made decisions on those estimates that exclude the risk. So last time we talked about that very famous economic estimate of climate damages produced by Nordhaus in 2002, and that came up with 2 or 3% GDP damage by 2100 if we hit 3 degrees of warming. And then you look at the methodology, it ignores tipping points, nature impact, human health impacts, conflict, migration, and it also excludes 87% of the economy because they work indoors, so it would be impacted by climate change.
Just every time I hear it, it drives me mad. Now, for anybody listening that might not know, I mean, that astounding assumption that, 87% of the economy will not be affected because it's indoor. He won the Nobel Prize in economics for that work in 2018, which is just, I mean, it makes you want to cry, really.
Yeah, and he was lauded for that, and that original estimate was 2002, and actually it's an important question, right? Important question for governments. What might the economic impact of climate change be? Because that's going to determine how much of a priority it is. Now, if you're a busy politician or policymaker, someone says to you, Rachel, I've got the results back from a very respected economist, it's been peer reviewed, and the economic impact of climate change is going to be 2% of GDP, your not unreasonable response is going to be, right, okay, this sounds much less worse. Great, exactly, thumbs up, than what the scientists were saying. So it's a lower priority. So we don't need to maybe move as fast as we ought to be moving, and that estimate has proven to be remarkably sticky. So there's a really fantastic document produced by a company you may have heard of, Liberty Energy. So Chief Executive Chris Wright, President-elect Trump's Energy Secretary, and it's a great document. It talks about energy bettering human lives and how important energy is, and all that kind of good stuff. And it does talk about climate change. Clearly it's happening, and it quotes Nordhaus, and that's the justification for climate change being a low priority. Now, I don't know Chris Wright, but he's clearly a busy person, chief executive of an energy company. Is it reasonable to expect him to critically examine the assumptions underpinning that estimate? I don't think it is, and I don't think it's reasonable for many people to do that. But that's what actuaries are trained to do. So, unfortunately, that combination of what you could call scientific reticence and economic estimates of climate change that exclude uncertainty rather than making a sensible assumption, have meant that policymakers, in my view, have been making decisions based on very flawed risk information, making decisions based on information that simply excludes the risks. And I kind of call it climate modelling land. And if everyone listening blinks and opens their eyes, you're now in climate modelling land. It looks exactly like the real world because we're modelling the real world, but it's magical because, as I've talked to you, there are no tipping points, no human health impacts, no nature impacts, blah, 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 blah. Now, what has happened over time is the economic estimates of climate change have got more severe as people have loaded more stuff in. So I think the recent paper, I think Kotz et al., we reference it in the report, that's now saying, I think, something like an expectation of a 19% GDP hit by 2050 on current trajectories. So way more damage than the investment cost of executing the energy transition. But that's hot off the press. So policymakers, that hasn't yet reached policymaker circles. And I think that's really the whole thrust of this report is we need policymakers to be presented with risk-led information informed by science, not science-led information. And the difference there, if I use the analogy of crossing a river, imagine you had to cross a river. I'm conscious you're about to head off to all sorts of exotic places, so imagine you have to cross a river in Africa, and you'd be interested in the depth of the river, particularly any deep pools, and you'd be interested to know if any crocodiles are in the river. And you might see something that looks like a log, but maybe it's a crocodile. Tell you what, you're not going to go into that river until you've ascertained it's a log. Now, risk-led communication would say it is possible there is a crocodile in the river and there is a deep pool. Science communication would say the average depth of the river is 0.5 metre, and there may be other factors, but we're not sure about them. And so the science-led information would simply exclude the crocodile, whereas risk-led information would major on the crocodile. Maybe it's unlikely, but the impact, if it does happen, is so significant we wouldn't enter the water.
I think that's such a good analogy, and actually I have to say your report is littered with good analogies. One of my favourite with regards to understanding how risk is currently calculated versus how it should be calculated was about the Titanic, and saying that, in our current assessments, it's sort of like, think about the risk of hitting an iceberg rather than understanding the risks of what hitting that iceberg would mean and how many people would end up in the water and how many, what would be the impact of hypothermia, what would be the impact on, the ocean environment around it. Like really getting to grips with the wider system and all of these interconnections. Now, Sandy, I have to ask, because it's been about a year since we spoke, maybe a little bit longer, and that report, my audience reaction to that report was, everybody was sort of amazed. I think it was very helpful that it has, University of Exeter stamped on it and the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries stamped on it. Mm-hmm. But did you manage to get it in front of policymakers? It's been a year. This isn't fresh off the press, as you just said.
Key question. I think we're making traction. I don't think we're there yet. I've been working with a coalition of finance ministers for climate action, so really trying to push this concept of risk-led messaging into that group, and I think finance ministers are really important. We have had some conversations with Labour MPs, but I think there's more to do, and actually that's what we're calling for in this report is realistic, systemic, effective global risk management to be put in place. We've developed a set of principles that are resilience principles, a kind of a checklist of principles for how to actually assess these global systemic risks effectively. My real concern is that if we don't get effective risk management practices in place delivered to the very highest levels of policymakers, we will continue to go blindly forth towards these risks. So it's we've had some traction, but we're not there yet.
It's just amazing when you think about the contrast. And I'm going to use British examples, although there are characters like these everywhere. If you think about the contrast between what you're saying and the possible risk to GDP, and you contrast that with characters like Nigel Farage and other Tufton Street, proxy employees going on mainstream television and saying that, we can't afford to do the energy transition, or net zero is going to cost us too much money. Like, that's the radical message that's out in the mainstream public consciousness, which is, gaining traction all the time despite mounting evidence. And then you compare it with this, and it would suggest that if GDP really is the thing that we all care about and it should be the thing that is protected, then you would think that people would want to have this information in front of them, would want to understand the risks that were being taken, and would be keen to implement a series of policies that would protect the economy at all costs. Because for the life of me, that's what our, politics seems to be centered on in the West, protecting the economy at all costs. But it's just another one of these cognitive dissonances that I cannot make sense of.
Right, and 100% agree, but I mean, I've not met Nigel Farage. My working assumption, and maybe I'm being naive here, is that people who are not people operate to a set of beliefs, and if in your circle you've seen the Nordhaus work and actually a bunch of other works which show climate damages to be relatively small, and you strongly believe it's all about the economy, then it's not unreasonable. Now, I obviously disagree with that message. I think we need to change the narrative to net zero is an economic and financial imperative, not an acceptable cost. There are two parts to that. One, the comparison with the damages, as you've talked to, is it conceivable? Well, you can paint a scenario where global warming continues to accelerate, it's exacerbated by nature, loss, nature impacts, there's significant socio-political consequences. We have significant mortality events and GDP loss. So that not having that outcome makes it much more positive. But even the costs of a renewable energy system are much, much lower than a fossil system. So yeah, we really need to change that narrative. But that's something we put in the report, and that's where this risk-led messaging makes it very clear. If we don't change course, then these extreme or catastrophic impacts are eminently plausible, whether on those dimensions we talked about, economy, population, climate, nature, societal disruption. But we also call for kind of what they call it, education, training, etc. Because as you and many of your listeners know, our current economic model is energy blind, and it's climate blind, and it's ecosystem blind. So although the economy is literally built on raw materials and energy, our current economic model doesn't see that. It sees labour and capital. So we have a deeply flawed model, and a generation of leaders who have mostly been educated on that economic model. So yes, we have to have the risk-led messaging, but we also have to have that consciousness shift, because currently we have these two kind of parallel systems: the Earth system, our life support system, and the economic system, which now has kind of a loose coupling over the Earth system, but has very different objectives from most of the humans and other creatures that live in the Earth system. So, while Planetary Solvency is very much focused on the risk message and putting in place these kind of risk management principles and reporting, and that very strong message that if we don't change course, we're heading for extreme or catastrophic risk levels. We're also strongly pointing to the need for that education, that mindset shift, that shift in consciousness, because Western reductionism has created a world where the financial system sees itself as separate from the real economy, sees itself as separate from nature, the earth system, etc., which actually provides everything we need. So there is work to do.
There's one final point I want to tease out here, Sandy, and that's about net zero. You referenced before we started recording James Dyke, who came on the show a couple of months ago, was talking about entropy. His episode and some of his work has essentially shown that, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but like net zero was in a sense like a kind of misleading goal because it's actually, facilitated the continuation of extractivism, exploitation, and also just hasn't worked. You've said in your report that current climate models aren't fully understanding risk, but you also just said that net zero is a financial imperative. So what are the changes that need to be made to net zero policies broadly to make it effective for mitigating against the worst risks that we face this century?
Oh, what a great question. So I'd go with a couple of things on that. If you look at transition success stories, they are policy driven. Norway has over 90% of new car sales electric, and that's due to policy. Britain has lots of offshore wind, and that's due to policy. Britain doesn't have offshore wind because 20 years ago you and me and a load of other people said, let's build wind farms. It was a government energy policy decision. So perhaps the biggest, and you look at the pace that China is moving, despite being a big emitter, government policy. So it's very clear to me that market-led approaches will not deliver, and government policy needs to deliver. I'm going to go down a tiny rabbit hole here. You'll be familiar with the personal carbon footprint concept, and you'll probably know exactly where that came from. Came from fossil fuel companies, and brilliant because you distract from government energy policy decisions if everybody's talking about personal carbon footprints, a playbook copied by the plastics industry in response to US Congress first talking about plastics in the 50s, and they created this narrative that it's about recycling, and that's very embedded even today. So that's the biggest shift we need to see, is that this needs to be led by government policy. The other big shift, which is critically important, is we need to be realistic about carbon budgets. Edinburgh has done some big infrastructure projects recently, built a tram, built a new Parliament building. The budgeting for both those projects was absolutely horrific, and they cost 50 or 100 times what they were budgeted for. Now, carbon budgets are very uncertain because the Earth system is very uncertain. So you have lots of feedback loops, potential tipping points. I was reading a report this morning that says that the Arctic has tipped from a carbon sink to carbon source in 2024. I know, right? I know. So the Amazon might tip, etc. So carbon budgets are predicated on no tipping points, no surprises, and a range of other assumptions, like are the greenhouse gas levels not increasing, but we know that methane is increasing, blah, blah, blah. So if you look at the assumptions underpinning carbon budgets, they're heroic to say the least, when you take them together. And in, again, borrowing from actuarial work, if you run an insurance company, you have to make assumptions about the future, and every year you test your assumptions and adapt them, update them. We're not doing that with carbon budgets. So we're at 1.5 degrees of warming. So for me, the carbon budget has to be negative now. I would what's called overshoot. Now, people will say, but that's all right, we're going to come back to 1.5 degrees by 2100. Well, again, check out the plausibility of the assumptions of the overshoot scenarios. Scientists looked at 1,200 overshoot scenarios. This was a few years ago now, and I think they found 6 because they felt had plausible assumptions. Many of those, right, yes, the eyebrows are raised. Like a stunningly small amount, I think we wrote about that in Climate Scorpion. And if you look at the assumptions in many of the overshoot scenarios, they assume things like we will draw down from the atmosphere every year more carbon than we ship fossil fuels annually. Nuts. So the policy support is absolutely critical to kind of accelerate the technology disruption. There's kind of positive S-curves of technology disruption, which we're starting to see in many locations. A fantastic report out from Rocky Mountain Institute this month. But equally critical is realistic carbon budgets, because they are out of date, they're not realistic, and they're not going to achieve the Paris goal. So even if we get to net zero by 2050, we're going to be way above the temperatures we're aiming for. As we talked about, that means way more risk than people expect. And it's a bit like a broken record on this, but where there is uncertainty, there's a thing called the precautionary principle. If you don't know, if you think it might be a crocodile, don't get in the water. Don't assume it's, and that's kind of what we're doing, the opposite of the precautionary principle. Where there's uncertainty, we're excluding it and crossing our fingers and hoping everything goes in our direction. So a specific recommendation we make on climate change is that it should be an annual process to update carbon budgets, because currently there is increasing awareness that we're over 1.5 degrees, but it's kind of nobody's job and everybody's job to work out what to do about that. But it's going to become, it is already, I think, very clear that net zero would deliver the Paris goals, and we need to update those budgets.
Sandy, thank you very much. This is fascinating as always, grim as always, but the fact that...
Yeah, I'm quite a cheerful person.
I know.
I'd like not to be doing this.
Wouldn't we all
Yes.
like to be doing something just quite nice, all just reciting, poetry together on a Saturday night, not reading reports
please.
about our Earth systems collapsing. Now, am I correct? Am I fair to say, Sandy, in a previous conversation, this was a figure that we came at, and I really wanted to pull this out in the episode, if it's correct. Are we looking at possibly a 50% drop in GDP by 2070? Possibly.
Yeah, I mean, we've published that previously. Other organisations have published analysis showing that level of GDP impact. What's important for people to understand is these are models. There are lots of ways of doing the modelling. Depending on how you do the modelling, you get different answers. Every model is a simplification. You have to decide what to include and what not to include. There are various ways to do the math. We think, though, it's much more sensible to work backwards from ruin than working forwards from an unrepresentative past and excluding all the risks from your model. And we'd suggest it's much better to adopt a prudent approach and more severe damages than is not to. So that particular analysis, I haven't got it in front of me. I think we said 50% damage at maybe 3 degrees of warming, and depending on how quickly you warm, that was the 2070 to 2090 piece, right? Depending on some of the assumptions you make. So at the current rates of warming, is it possible we could hit 3 degrees by 2050? Well, some people might say that's very unlikely, but it's certainly possible. Although it would be very bad. So could you see, based on that rationale, 50% GDP damage by 2050? Well, potentially. Now, I've put that forward to people as this should be our downside stress. This should be the measure that is we're using to incentivize action. And the response I get is, well, how do you know? I'm like, well, I don't, but this is called risk management. Let's imagine multiple tipping points, catastrophic food system impacts, water shortages, and voluntary mass migration. How can you justify not having really significant GDP impacts, and fully accepting this is not all about GDP? Clearly, there's potential for immense human immiseration and natural catastrophes, not to mention the natural world. So yeah, I mean, my strong view is it's better to be sanguine and prudent about the potential downside risks and use that analysis to guide the action you take than continuing to stick your fingers in your ears, ignore the difficult stuff, and hope for the best.
But it's so much easier. No, we could go back and forward on that all day.
Yeah.
Sandy, this was really interesting. Thank you so much for this. I will make sure that the links to the report are available for everybody so they can go and download it and read it themselves. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Luke Kemp. We'll go with Luke Kemp. Luke's been a fantastic co-author. I think he and some of his colleagues in the existential risk space think deeply and carefully about this sort of stuff. So he's in particular a scholar of societal collapse. So I think he would have a lot to say.
Brilliant. Sounds like just the kind of guest for Planet Critical.
Yes. He's a pretty upbeat guy as well.
I love that. I find that we all tend to be, because if you're not laughing, you're crying.
Right. You have to be.
You do. Sandy, thank you so much for your time today. This was great.
My pleasure. Great to see you again, Rachel. Thank you.
You too.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.